Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my most favorite books of all time, which is The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. And I decided just to do sort of a random doodling here on my iPad. I was feeling kind of too lazy to put together a slideshow, and I'm not very good at sketching out ideas or stories. So just going to be a random drawing here and talking about this book and why I like it so much. And just a quick note on translations, because the original book was in German. I've really listened to it 3 times, read it 1 time. The first 2 times I listened to the David Barnes audiobook on LibriVox, which is free. It's public domain, in fact. And the translator is David Wiley, and I really thought that was a good one. I also listened to a Benedict Cumberbatch audiobook, which was abridged, and that one was pretty good too. And then finally, Susan Bernofsky. Her version is the one I read, the version I got for Christmas, and I really enjoyed that one as well. Although I will say that though most of the book is the same across those translations, at least from my memory, it's kind of interesting if you look at the very first sentence in the book. Let me read it for you. So, for those of you who don't know, the book is about what happens after this man, Gregor Samsa, wakes up and finds himself transformed into a creature, and different books kind of translate this differently. So in Susan's version, she writes, "When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect." And the original German word for this is Ungeziefer. I don't think I said that right, but anyway, so it's been translated into insect and vermin and bug in different translations. And I think vermin might be the best translation choice there, because the original word means an unclean animal unfit for sacrifice. And that's kind of an interesting word in and of itself, which you might want to keep in the back of your mind as we talk about the story. So yes, I mentioned it's about a guy who wakes up one day. One thing to know about Gregor is he's a traveling salesman, so he actually supports his family by going door to door and selling something. I don't think it ever really says what he sells. So the Samsa family lives pretty comfortably. The father and mother are elderly, and the young daughter is a teenager, but Gregor is the only one who works and manages to keep them pretty comfortably in their city house. So when the time comes that he wakes up and he's suddenly in the form of this monstrous vermin or this beetle, it's quite a shock to the family. And they're really not sure how to react. And so the book follows their reactions to his situation, his own reactions, and the changes that take place in all of the characters as they come to terms with this transformation, this metamorphosis. And what I want to focus on in this brief video is the different ways you can read this book, because it is written in a very simplistic style. There's a lot of room for interpretation. So the most obvious way to read it is as a tragedy. That's how I read it the first couple of times. Gregor, a very successful young man, suddenly finds himself unable to take care of himself or to take care of others as he's been doing, and that's quite a shock for him. And the way his family reacts tends to be very negative, mixture of fear and disgust and loathing and finally hatred. And it is very tragic if you just read it kind of straight through, taking it as it says on the tin, so to speak. A second way to read it, and one way that I would say a lot of college professors would probably advocate for, is as a comedy. A lot of people do read Kafka as dark comedy in general, and you can kind of see how they might do that. It's at its very most core, the story is about a guy who sleeps in and wakes up as an insect, which is kind of funny in itself. Even Gregor kind of seems to take it lightheartedly as he starts to get accustomed to having lots of legs in a hard shell. There's a lot of funny things that happen throughout the story. There's one scene where Gregor and his father are kind of running around the room as the father's trying to chase him. And there's a servant that comes to work for this family after the other servants have left, who finds the whole situation kind of interesting rather than scary. And then even Gregor's manager from his job comes to visit, and it's kind of entertaining the way he takes this situation, and how Gregor for a moment, well, I won't get too much into that, but there are definitely moments of humor. So the third time I read it, I did see that very clearly. This last time I read the book, however, a week or two ago, I was really struck by a few things that stood out in the story, and it seemed to me almost like a mystery, because there's this one section, or I should say this one line at the beginning of the book. Let's see. He was in danger of losing his position. His boss would start hounding his parents once more over their ancient debt. So there's a subtext here that Gregor is working for this company, because his parents are in debt to this business. And again, Gregor's father is not working. He claims to be too feeble to do so. So Gregor is having to do everything. And then the other part that kind of gives us an air of mystery is Gregor mentions that he was feeling fine the day before he woke up, but he had this sense of foreboding and this idea that he might have to take a sick day, and that, or that he won't take a sick day, he'll just come into work and he'll get over it. And I think we've all had days like that, so I found that particularly relatable and a little sinister for sure. You might almost wonder, does Gregor have some part in whatever this is that's come over him? Has he somehow induced it upon himself, or is he simply a victim? So there's kind of two ways you can read that, which I think add to the mystery and the intrigue. Here a little later in the book, about halfway through, it talks about how his father had a business which had collapsed. So that kind of goes into that situation of the debt once more. And then we've got the character of the sister, Greta, who's quite a character. And there's a lot of ambiguity about Greta. I think, she starts out very compassionate and considerate, and really the only person who still seems to love Gregor. But as the story goes on, her attitude switches from taking care of him to being possessive of him, and not only possessive, but determining his fate. That's very, it kind of becomes a little dark there, and you're not really sure whether she had always been comfortable with the way things were before Gregor had this problem, or whether this is kind of her chance now to exert herself as an individual and as someone her parents will be proud of. Because it's interesting that earlier in the story, her parents aren't very proud of Greta because she just stays at home and she plays violin and she doesn't really do anything for the family, so to speak. So I might even get into that more a little bit later, but I wanted to talk about the last way you can read the story. So we talked about tragedy, comedy, mystery. Final one I want to touch on, of course, is allegory. Again, there's kind of an obvious allegory here. Gregor becomes dependent. We can think of people that are dependent in society for various reasons, and how society treats them oftentimes negatively and just writes them off. And that's very thought-provoking, very relevant to today. Another thing that I considered was, when this book was written, was 1915, or at least when it was published. And consider that was during World War I. So you've got this atmosphere of the lost generation and a division between the old generation and the young generation. There's definitely a deep misunderstanding between Gregor Samsa and his father, who just completely is repulsed by Gregor. And it reminded me of a scene from this documentary I saw, I think last year. It was called They Shall Not Grow Old, and it's by Peter Jackson of the Lord of the Rings fame. And at the end of the documentary, they talk about these guys coming back from the war. And one guy in particular was talking about how his father didn't understand anything and had a different opinion, which he was very, very strongly opinionated about, but had no idea what his son had suffered out there in the actual battlefield. So definitely think that kind of plays into this. Another kind of obvious one would be materialism. The family becomes, I'd say, reduced in circumstances as the story goes on, but they also don't lose their materialism. In fact, as they all go into the workforce, as they must, to support themselves, you get the sense that it's not just to keep themselves afloat, but they're starting to become more materialistically minded, I guess. And again, the way they treat Gregor after he can no longer provide for them is also, it very much points to this idea that they've become subservient to their standard of living and more. Finally, a last type of allegory you can pull from this is loss of faith. So early in the story, the mother, Gregor's mother, believes that Gregor will be, that it's possible he may be able to be restored to his old self, and things will be able to get back to normal. And she holds on to that for a long time and then finally gives up. And I think it's really unfortunate. Again, getting back to, people that have disabilities, people who have been in comas and have waken up years later. Like, it's so, I think the world tends to be really cynical, and this book is an example of what can happen if you completely lose faith and don't hold out hope that there can be positive change. And that very cynicism and that very loss of faith are definitely two of the factors that contribute to Gregor's downfall. So that the psychological element is very strong here. And it's, again, one of the things I really love about the story is it's so simple, and yet it hits upon all of these really, really deep and important emotions and psychological drama. So that's really all I had to say about the Metamorphosis. It's a very short story, so I recommend reading it if you haven't. And let me know if you have read it. What did you think? I know some people don't really care for the story or Kafka in general. Let me know your thoughts. And if you have any ideas for future videos, let me know. I plan to maybe do a little series on some of my favorite books and why they're my favorite. And I'm not sure if I'm going to continue with the drawings, but let me know if you liked it, if you didn't like it. That's always welcome to hear as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.